Hello everyone and welcome. As usual, I'm DJ Zelix from Team Lone Wolf, here with once more another immersive railroading tutorial video. Quick note, if my voice sounds slightly different or like slightly not quality wise but like how loud it is, or if you hear more background noise than usual, I'm in a different recording location than usual, so I'm sorry about that. But anyways, getting back on hand, today's episode is going to be tracks. So we get to actually start using the machines that we built last time. Now you might notice that I picked up a new pickaxe and shovel. Don't worry about it. I finally have some clear weather daytime stuff here so that I don't have to worry about that. But anyways, getting back on hand, let's actually figure out how we do this. So tracks require a very specific tool in order to do that, and that's called the track blueprint. So what you're going to need is a piece of paper right in the center and steel on either side, very similar to how we made the manual, except instead of a book, it's just paper. And it gives us the track blueprint. Shush cow. Now, if we right click with it, it brings up this GUI, and this is specifically in air, just as a quick note. It brings up this GUI. And we can see there's a couple of different things here, and I'll be going through these one at a time. However, a quick note is that this is before the track rewrite. So I will be making another video post track rewrite that explains how how to do all this with the new track setup. So just keep that in mind. So what exactly does all this mean? So the first one at the very top is type. We currently have 5 types, I believe. We've got straight, crossing, slope, turn, switch, 6, and turntable. So what does this all mean? So straight is exactly what you think it would be. It's a straight piece of track, doesn't deviate. Crossing is if you want, as you can see when you bring, if you aim at the ground, a almost ghost image of what you're going to be placing down will appear. So it is literally a track crossing, so you can have a train go one way and another go other way in the exact same 3x3 area. And I'll be going over that a bit more in just a little bit. Next is slope, which is exactly what you think it is. And I'll explain a bit more detail how this works, but as you can see, it's just a slope. Turn, which is exactly what you think. Of note is that turn and then the one after that, which is switch, brings up this slider right here, which is so and such degree turn. And you can change the slider and it changes how many degrees. What the degrees do is that, so say I've got this here. As you can see, it makes a full turn, like a full right turn. If I bring this down to 45, it is now going at a 45 degree angle. It doesn't change the radius of the circle, it just changes how much of the circle the turn makes. So 22.5 makes 22.5 degree turn, and so on, so such. It only has those 4 degrees, so don't worry too much about that. Switch is very similar, and I'll be going over this bit more in a second. But it acts almost the exact same way as the turn in regards to the degree turn. Excuse me. And then we have turntable. And we're going to actually kind of fly up. I don't mean to be in creative mode, but it's a lot easier to see kind of these tracks if you're flying. So, there we go. So you can see that it's a straight piece of track and then a bunch of small stubs at the end. Quick note, there is 16 of these stubs, and they are at those degrees that I mentioned earlier. So 22.5, 45, 76.5, or 72.5, I believe, and then 90 degrees, or 0 degrees. 67.5, my bad. Oh, shoot. I need that. There we go. Okay. Let me actually go ahead and switch this over to survival. So, what does the next thing do? So, next we have a, like a number that we can just type in. As you notice that if I try and type in, I'm pressing the 0 button and it won't type in any higher. The highest you can type in currently is 100. That is a configuration option. You can change that both on the server end and also client end. By default, it is a max of 100, but you can change that. So what does this number do exactly? Well, it's how long the track is. So as you notice, the track is now a whole lot longer than it was last time. It's now 100 blocks long. With the crossing, it doesn't do anything. Crossing is not affected by that number. Slope, you'll notice the slope is a lot longer now. The way that slope works is that it's how many blocks long it is, and the slope piece rises by 1 block. So if I place this down, it would be 100 blocks and then 1 block up, is how, think of it. If I did 10, be 10 blocks and 1 block up, and as you can see, it's a whole lot steeper. General recommendation, well, I'll actually go over those in a bit. Just change that to 12. So turn, what does that number actually do for the turns and switches? Well, it changes the radius of the turn. So this is 12, and let's say I change it to 20. You can notice it's a lot wider of a turn. It just changes the radius of the circle. That radius is not affected by the slider, so don't worry about that. That's completely and totally separate. Same with the switch, just changes how big the radius is. It will also increase the length of the straight section of a switch. And then for turntable, it is, if I remember correctly, the diameter of the turntable is how long it is. Actually, it might actually be radius. We can check in a second. So that's what that number actually means. Next up, we have rail bed. And I'll be kind of explaining rail bed and rail bed fill in just a second once we actually get down to placing some track. Next is position. Position has 4 selectors, or sorry, 5. Fixed, pixels, pixels locked, smooth, and smooth locked. So what exactly does that change? So if it's position fixed, you'll notice that no matter where I'm aiming, it's centered on a block. If I switch it to pixels, I can move it in accordance to pixels, which means that you've got a lot more options for placing down track. Next is pixels locked. It's very similar to pixels, however, it is locked. If you're going straight, it is locked within that linear axis, if you will. So if I got it like this, it's not really locked, but if I'm going X or Y, it is locked within that axis, which means that you can be a bit more precise about how you want that track placed. Next is smooth. Smooth is exactly what you think it is. It's very like pixels, except it's not like tiny increments. It's literally smooth. It's exactly where you place your cursor down. Smooth locked is the same as pixels locked. You can't. It's in an axis. You can't really move it over by to side is essentially by fixed. There we go. That's kind of what I was trying to say earlier. That's my bad. I usually play with fixed. Makes it a bit easier. If necessary, pixels locked. I'll explain that a little bit later down the road. Next is direction. Direction is not really useful unless you're using a turn. What that just means is that, as you notice, it can sometimes be hard to get the turn you want, or it turning the correct way. You can use direction to make sure it is locked in a specific direction. So this is locked left and locked right. And you'll notice that it does slightly change the item in your hand, which does update to whatever type you have selected, as a quick note. Excuse me? I'm sorry about that. Excuse me. Cereal. And then finally we have gauge. So for those of you that aren't really big into railroads, gauge is the distance between your rails. The base mod comes with 5 gauges. Let me cycle this over. What in the world? Why in the world are those appearing? weird. Okay, there is. I swear to God, the base mod has 5 gauges, and I'll explain why those kind of are. They shouldn't really be appearing, but why they're there, they appear. So we've got Brunel, which you notice is pretty big. You won't really use this necessarily. I think of this as being like 5 blocks across. Next is standard, which is 3 blocks across. This is for the most part, in accordance to the U.S. standard for standard gauge on how wide the tracks are. Then you have narrow. Let me actually... Lovely, there we go. Narrow, which is kind of... It's almost 1 block. This is also a standard, but I don't remember what standard it's set to off the top of my head, sadly, which kind of sucks. Next is... Here we go. Next is Minecraft. Now, Minecraft is a bit of a weird gauge. Oops, didn't mean to do that. As you can see, it's directly within 1 block, and if we place this side by side, or like right next to a standard Minecraft track piece, a rail piece, you'll notice that the gauge is the exact same between the two. So it's not actually a gauge you'll find in real life, not easily. It's just the gauge that fits within the Minecraft tracks, is what that gauge actually is. And then finally, we have model gauge, which is this tiny little gauge. And you might notice that you kind of freeze up when you're using it. IR has a weird thing with smaller gauges. It will like stutter almost. Now, the weird thing to note about the model gauge is that you would think it's like G gauge or something. It's actually closer to 7.5 inches between the rails is actually what it's closer to. So don't worry too much about how big it looks. It's actually a bit bigger than you would think it is. And all of these are actually defined inside of immersive railroading using millimeters. So if you decide to look up the exact distances between tracks, those numbers are in millimeters. So just be aware of that. Also, if you decide to make your own gauges with a resource pack, which I will explain a bit later, or in a different episode, I'll kind of explain how you set that all up. Those are defined in millimeters, so just be aware of that. There we go. So back to standard. Actually, you know what? I'll leave it as standard. So now that we have this, what can we do with it? Well, obviously we can place track. So the way you make track in the mod is a bit complicated. I don't want to say it's super complicated, but it can be a bit complicated. So the first thing you're actually going to need to do is make a ton upon ton of treated wood. There we go. Using that exact recipe. And, oh, dang it, I accidentally made chest. Oh well, I'll use those for later episodes. I have a creative fluid tank here, just as a quick note, so don't worry about that. However, if the way you make it is through immersive engineering, using the coke ovens, which as a byproduct creates creosote. So that's where you get those. So the treated wood planks is actually the ties between the rails. So that's what those are used for. Now, how do we make rails themselves? So we are actually going to need to use some of the machines we've made over here. First thing we're going to need to use is the casting basin. Good lord, I can speak. I'm just going to throw some blocks of steel into here. I might be able to actually throw this whole stack in here. Good lord. Huh. Got me impressed. So, opening up this GUI, we'll actually finally get to kind of talk about this. So, on here, you'll notice there's type, the gauge, standard casting, and repeat casting. The gauge is important, and I'll kind of explain why in just a few moments. But first, you're going to press type, and you'll notice once it's actually loaded, this kind of weird image appear. And this will look different for you if you have resource packs, as it does update with resource packs. But what you're seeing here is all of the available rolling stock you can make, along with a rail casting, steel ingot, block of steel in case you need to reclaim that for one reason, and then all of the augments, and we'll be covering the augments in another episode. But first, we're going to be wanting to press rail casting, and if you hover over it, you'll notice gauge standard. Don't really worry about that. You only need to kind of worry about that with all the other ones, but not with the rail casting. So click on that, and you'll notice that down here it has 0 out of 20. The 20 is how much steel you're going to use in order to make that casting. And we're going to want to keep it a standard, but you can cycle through this, and it's just like the track blueprint. It's the various gauges. If you want to make a specific gauge track, you need to have that specific gauge rail casting. You cannot use rail casting for standard gauge for, say, narrow gauge. So you need to make sure that you cast it in the correct gauge. Now you can throw the rail castings back into the crafting basin. They will reheat and you can reuse them again, but just be aware of that in case you're having issues, is to make sure you've got the right gauge of rail casting. So let's go standard. Now, how do we actually cast these? So we have two buttons here. We've got single casting and repeat casting. If we press single casting, it will, as you can see, cast it up, and if I pop out of here, you can see got sound and particle effects. And now if we right click it, you'll notice that I've picked it up. So here we go. We have a rail casting now. You'll notice it's a big old object. But we can't use it just yet, and I'll explain why. So if we right click this again, the repeat casting is very similar to the single casting, right? Click it, it'll just keep casting. So once this is finished, right click it, it'll start casting again. The way you turn it off is you either right click it while it's still casting and click it again. You will need to press single casting in order to finish the cast, though. Sorry if that's a bit loud. Right click it, or you shift right click it, and it will bring up the GUI. Ow. That hurt. So, what do we do with these now? Because these are not ready to be used. If you look on here, you'll notice that it looks like a essentially block. It's a elongated rectangle. What you want to do is bring them over to the track machine that we made in the previous episode, and right click it. And you'll notice, sorry, it's a bit loud, but as you can see, it will transform into an actual rail. The molten iron or steel will appear on that side and slide through and make a rail. You just right click it again and it will pick it up. One of the rail castings will make 10 of the actual rail segments. So, since I made 3 of these pieces, it'll make 30 of these. And you can right click with to pick stuff up while you have the steel in your hand, and it will just swap it out, as you noticed. So now that we have some treated wood planks and some rail segment, what do we do now? Well, we can, first of all, come in here, and you'll notice that there's these last 2 tick boxes that I haven't really talked about. So you have place blueprint, geez, I can speak, and grade crossing. Grade crossing is more of like a cosmetic, if you will. And what it will do is that it will, if I place it down, don't think it really worked because I don't have any in my inventory. But if you have any sort of concrete from like the standard Minecraft concrete, it will place down that concrete in like a slope on either side to make it look like a rail, like a standard rail crossing that you can find out on the road. Now again, right click and it will place down the track. you'll notice that it will consume up the rail segment and the treated wood planks. And you'll notice that it consumes a lot of them. Now, how much it consumes is dependent on how long it is and also the gauge. If you've got a smaller gauge, it will actually consume less of the rail segments and treated wooden planks. So just be aware of that. And if you feel that you have placed it wrong, just break it with some sort of a pick, typically iron or above, and it will bring it back down to the rail segments and the treated wood planks. And it will be a perfect reclamation, so you don't lose anything in that process. If you feel that you don't quite know exactly how you want your rail set up and you need to plan it out, you can press the place blueprint button. And if I right click now, it will just create that blueprint. And it's very useful if you need to let me just do, there we go. If you want to kind of figure out how you want the track. So let's say I want it like this. I can turn this off. You don't have to, but I do it just so I keep it in my mind. And then you find where you've placed down that track blueprint, so you can see it kind of got this hitbox. And you shift left click it, and it will place down the all the parts that you need in order to make it. So now I've got a turn and a straight. Lovely. I'm actually going to pick these back up for just a moment. There we go. So that we can continue talking. So next we going along here, we've got the switch. So the way a switch works, and I don't actually have all that I needed for this, sadly. So let me really quickly make what I need. There we go. So now that I've got a lever, what I want to do, if I want to use, like, you want to change which way the track is going, you're going to want to find, like, this one tie that kind of sticks out. You're going to want to put the switch right next to it. And just by flicking the switch, you change which way the track is heading. And an easy way to tell is just by looking at the outside rail, whether or not it's it's perfectly smooth, or if it forms these two rails. And you'll also notice that the larger tie kind of slides in and out as a result. Now, if you've got these at an angle, so let's say I've got it like this, you might have a small bit of trouble finding that elongated rail. Just play around. It is there. It just might not be very easy to see sometimes. We are currently working on trying to make it be a bit easier on players, but as of the moment, we don't quite fully have that working. So just keep that in mind. So let me break that. Grab some cobblestone for the next part. So going on, we have the turntable. So I actually have a big old area cut out over here. Let's kind of talk about the turntable. So let me just leave it at 20. We now have a turntable, and you'll notice that it's just empty. Oops. It doesn't really have anything here. It looks kind of plain. Don't worry, that is normal. The way that you kind of can fix it, though, I picked up that trackbed that I just broke, is going over here with the rail bed. You want to click that, and you'll bring up this secondary GUI that will kind of give you a selection of blocks. We have a way of adding in additional blocks, but you have to go into the configuration files and manually change it yourself. You can't do it in-game, sadly. But by default, these are the blocks that you can use. So let's go with cobblestone, because that's what I've got in my inventory currently. You notice that the item has changed how it looks. If I place this down, don't place it down, you notice that it looks a lot different now. It looks a lot nicer. There's not really a whole lot of floating stuff. The middle two rails are floating. We're still working on making it look a bit nicer, but this is what we currently have. Now, how do we turn this? Well, we bring out the large wrench from last episode, and we just right-click and shift right-click, and it will change. It'll start rotating it. Simple as that. There's no real. I can't speak. There's no real way to change to like automate it, except using outside mods like extra utilities with the automated. No, that doesn't sound right. The mechanical user, that's the word I was looking for. The mechanical user or other such mods. And that's how you can kind of automate this, if you really want to. Take this. And going on to the last part, and again, it's perfect reclamation that includes the rail bed. Going on to the last part that we haven't really talked about yet is the rail bed fill. Now, if I click this, and let me turn it to dirt. That should just make us straight. You'll notice that if I hover over just empty air, actually, hold on, let me change this. You'll notice that it just brings up these red marks, and that just means that you can't build it there. This works also if you're trying to build through some sort of material. You can't really do it, and it'll throw up these like red markers so you can see where the problem is. It might not be immediately easy to see depending on it if it's a smaller gauge, but they are there. As you notice, you can't really place stuff hovering in midair. If you change the rail bed fill to say cobblestone, actually let me change it to dirt. Got some dirt actually that I can use. Actually, grass blocks, but oh well. You'll notice that it's no longer red. And if I right click it, it's okay, hold on. It's throwing an error. There's a weird problem with it not recognizing grass blocks as dirt. So that's what that was all about. But if I right click, you'll notice that it places down cobblestone where the problem spaces are, so it's not just free floating, which is very useful. And as you noticed, it kind of threw up this error, so you can see really what the problem is. And let's say we break this, and we try and place it down again. Break this, just trying to kind of clear out space. It will tell you what you're missing. So if you're trying to place down a piece of rail and you're missing like a certain amount of rails, rail bed fill, rail bed itself, or the ties, it will throw up a message in the text chat, and it's client side, so everyone won't see it. Don't worry. It will tell you how much you're missing in order to be able to build it, which I think is very useful. Now, as you saw earlier, there's these additional gauges that are throwing these really weird names. That's just because I don't have those resource packs activated. However, as you can see, you can add in additional gauges using resource packs. And if you've got them set up correctly, they will look very similar to how these normally do. It'll just say gauge and then the name. As you can see, for this one is 15 inch, 7.5 inch small scale, W2TF gauge, RISA, and so on and so such. Excuse me. And again, those are set using millimeters in the resource packs. So now that we've got that kind of covered, what are my tips for today in regards to all this? So let me go into, actually let me just use Minecraft because I need to go throw these back in, recast it all, but change this to Minecraft. And again, you'll notice that the costs change. Oops. Let me just change it to repeat casting. There we go. Oh, pick that up. Thank you. And I'm just really quickly doing this so that we have some rail to play around with. There we go. Okay, so now we've got some track to play around with. So, as you may have noticed, you can place track down at 4 different angles. Normal, 22.5, 45, and 67.5, as you may have noticed from the turns. If I want to place down this, you might notice that it doesn't really line up if you're on fixed. The way that I recommend doing this, and a lot of other people will recommend doing it, is changing it to pixels locked. And you can easily line it up using the pixels. And if that slight not quite lapping, or not quite perfectly lining up bugs you, you can of course change it to smooth locked, and you can get exactly how you want it. I usually use pixels locked because that small overlap, the code can handle that. It doesn't have a problem with that. There is a margin of displacement that you can have between tracks, and it doesn't really worry about it too much. This is very useful. Good lord. There we go. Okay. So this is very useful in my opinion if you want to say... Oh, oops. So let's say we have a 45-degree turn here. Typically, they don't quite line up, depending on the radius. There are certain numbers of radii that you can get that do line up perfectly. There's not really any easy way of finding out what those are. There's not a comprehensive chart that says what it is. So what I would recommend is going into pixels locked and perfectly lining it up. This of course also works with any of the other types of blocks, or of the other types of straight. Crossing works. You'll notice that crossing is specifically in those two axes. You can't really change, or you can't really have the crossing at angles, sadly. We're planning on trying to change how that works, but we don't have it implemented just yet. Well, you notice that slope works just fine. Turn obviously works. You can make some really nice looking track using this ability of having it kind of be off-centered, if you will. You can make some nice S-curves. Switches work with this, as you can imagine. Turntables, you'll notice that you can't really angle a turntable besides being in the two axes, but they do still place pixels like they are at an angle, but they won't build like they're at an angle. So, excuse me. Again, just to reiterate my earlier point. So we've got this. You notice that the tie is now in the middle, but since I place it technically next to that that wonky tie, I can still flip it. So you just need to be careful. If you look around, you'll typically find it. It can be sometimes hard to spot, but it is there. So that's really how tracks work. uh, I would recommend. No, before I finish up this episode, if I go to slope, this is something that a lot of us in the IR Discord notice people struggle with is how long should you have the slopes. Typically in real life, slopes are not actually all that steep. The steepest, I think, in the world that is not a cog railway is Cass Railway, and they use almost exclusively geared locomotives, which are meant for steep slopes. But all of our locomotives that we have in the mod currently do not handle those kinds of slopes. So typically what I would recommend is if you're at Minecraft or narrow gauge, I'd recommend at the least amount, at least a 20 gauge or a 20 length slope. If you're at standard, you're going to want probably a 50 at least, if not more. And 50 is still kind of pushing it. These are realistic physics. Keep that in mind, folks. You cannot have a train going up a slope of 2 unless you've got a really, really impressive run up and a lot of momentum going with you. I'm sorry, but that's just not realistic. Just saying. If you have a train that can make it up this, you probably are driving that train either with too much cars or that's a really fucking strong locomotive. Because that's just really absurd. So just keep that in mind, folks. The physics are realistic with these slopes. You do want to have something realistic. Each person will tell you different numbers that they would recommend. I recommend at least 20 for Minecraft and narrow, 50 for standard and Burnell at the least amount, if not more. I definitely recommend more, honestly. It also looks nicer, to be entirely honest. So just keep that in mind. Same goes with turns. There are certain radii that they can make it. So yes, a locomotive can make this. A locomotive can code-wise make this turn. Do I recommend you try and make this turn? Hell no. Even at, say, 10 for standard, that is a really, really, really tight curve. I don't care what locomotive you're riding around that sucker. That is a tight curve no matter what you do. With turns, there's no real, like, specific numbers that are perfect for them, sadly. You'll need to kind of experiment and find your own numbers, if you will. Some of the members of the community have specific numbers that they can recommend, but realistically, it's what you feel looks the most realistic, because they will work. The only curve that I don't think will really work is like a 2 or a 1. For obvious reasons. If you've got a curve that's a 1, you're doing something wrong. But, I mean, you kind of need to find your own numbers, sadly, when it comes to this. Most I can recommend is probably for narrow gauge and Minecraft gauge, at least a 20 minimum, if not bigger. And again, probably a 50 for standard or bigger. So you need to just kind of find out those numbers for yourself. It really kind of changes with who you are as a person. So that's it for today, covering tracks. Next episode is going to actually be covering the actual stock that you can put on tracks. So get excited for that. And also hand carts, because I figure that we can easily put in hand carts for rolling stock. So I'll be explaining that, and then after that we get into actual locomotives, so get excited for that. You'll notice that I will not be really responding to comments for this episode and the next episode about the week or so after I've released these, I will be on vacation and not really being paying attention to this. So just keep that in mind. I'll be kind of in communication for a bit of time. Don't worry. If you've got any questions, you can easily ask people in the Immersive Railroading Discord. You can find the link for that in the description below. So, as usual, hope you learned something and hope to see you in the next video. And as always, if you enjoyed it, make sure to leave a like, maybe even a subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you get notified when I post up the next video in this series, or you just want to see more gaming footage like this. And as always, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.